My name is Chloe. I'm 28, and the day my parents tried to cut me out of the family on paper, I finally understood that betrayal sounds different when it comes from people who raised you. It was quieter than I expected. No screaming, no broken glass, no dramatic slap across the face. Just my older brother leaning back in one of my father's leather chairs, crossing one ankle over his knee like he already owned the room, and saying the family trust should go to the child who had actually built something with his life. He meant himself. Then he glanced at me and added that I should probably receive a few personal items, maybe something sentimental, maybe enough cash to keep me from becoming desperate, but definitely not enough to reward a lifetime of drift. My mother nodded. My father didn't even look embarrassed. And that was the real loss, bigger than any inheritance, bigger than the house, bigger than the money they thought they were protecting from me. In that moment, the last small stubborn part of me that had still hoped they might one day surprise me with love died in that oak-paneled library in Connecticut. Because I could have survived being the disappointment. I had survived that for years. What hurt was seeing them formalize it. Reduce me to a line item. Turn all the contempt they'd been feeding me my entire life into something neat enough to sign in front of a lawyer. My brother Mason was 32, and had spent most of his adult life being applauded for breathing with confidence. My parents treated him like the proof that they had done life correctly. He was their golden child. The one with the right job, the right watch, the right smile for a country club lunch. The one who always seemed to enter a room expecting people to shift around him. I was the other one. The cautionary tale. The child they used whenever they wanted to remind each other how lucky they were to have Mason. And if you stay with me, you'll hear the exact moment that room changed. The exact moment my brother stopped talking like an heir and started sounding like a man who had just realized the floor under him wasn't real. Because before that meeting ended, the family that called me useless was going to learn that the mansion they were sitting in had never really been theirs. If you've ever sat in a room with your own family and felt yourself shrink while they decided who you were, stay with me. This isn't one of those stories where the truth wins because someone suddenly grows a conscience. It wins because paper does what people won't, and some lies only die when they're forced to read the truth out loud. I grew up in a house where value was always measured out loud. That sounds small until you live in it. In homes like mine, love isn't absent. It's conditional. It's strategic. It's handed out in ways that teach everyone where they stand. And from the time I was old enough to notice patterns, I knew Mason was being raised like an investment, while I was being treated like a budget cut no one wanted to discuss. If Mason got a B in school, it was because his classes were too advanced. If I got an A, it was because I worked too hard and lacked instinct. If Mason changed his mind, it meant he had ambition. If I changed mine, it meant I was unstable. My mother Eleanor loved language that sounded polished enough to pass for wisdom. She'd smile over dinner and say things like, "Some people are builders, and some people just take up space while the builders work." She never had to say which child was which. My father Richard was quieter, but that almost made him worse. My mother performed the hierarchy. My father endorsed it. He would sit at the head of the table, cut his steak, and let whatever cruel thing she had just said settle over the room like a decision. Mason learned early that he was safest when he stayed aligned with them. So he did more than align. He became fluent in their values. He knew exactly how to talk about money in ways that made people feel small. He knew how to mention salaries, vacation properties, golf memberships, market conditions, and serious careers in a tone that turned ordinary life into a moral failure. He learned that the easiest way to be loved in my family was to help create a person who could be looked down on. That person was me. I wasn't rebellious. That would have been easier, actually. At least rebellion gives people a clean story to tell about you. I was careful, quiet, self-supporting as early as I could be. I worked in high school, saved in college, and learned very quickly that the fastest way to get punished in my family was to need anything, so I tried not to. When I was in college, Mason got his first real office job and my parents acted like he'd been elected to the presidency. My mother hosted a dinner. My father opened a bottle he'd been saving. Mason talked for 20 minutes about trajectory and long-term upside and how most people didn't understand the value of positioning yourself early. I remember sitting there in a dress I'd bought on clearance, exhausted from classes and work, and when my mother finally turned to me, it was only to say, And Chloe's still figuring things out. Still, that word followed me for years. Still freelancing. Still driving that car. Still renting. Still not settled. Still not where Henderson is. It didn't matter that I paid my own bills. It didn't matter that I never asked them to rescue me. It didn't matter that half the time Mason's supposedly effortless success was being subsidized by introductions, connections, family cover, and the kind of social grooming I never got. In my family, independence only counted if it looked expensive. If it looked modest, they called it failure. I worked freelance for a while, and I know exactly what that sounds like to people like my parents. They hear unstructured and translate it into unimpressive. They hear self-employed and think not real. So every holiday became its own little trial. What are you doing now? Who are your clients? Is that sustainable? Do you have benefits? Are you still doing that online thing? My mother once told me in front of 12 people at Thanksgiving that I should really start answering those questions more simply, because serious adults don't want to pitch sweetheart, they want reassurance. Everyone laughed except me. And Mason, who didn't laugh either. He smirked. That was always his favorite expression around me. Not anger, not pity, smug amusement. Like my whole existence was some long-running family anecdote he never got tired of hearing. There are humiliations that sting for a day, and then there are the ones that rearrange your posture. Mine weren't usually dramatic enough to sound shocking when repeated back. That was part of what made them so effective. My family rarely said anything monstrous. They said small things consistently in front of witnesses with just enough elegance to make me sound oversensitive if I pushed back. Mason would ask if I needed gas money as a joke. My mother would hand me leftovers to take home, as if she were donating to a cause. My father would look at my car in the driveway and say, "I suppose reliability matters when you're not trying to make an impression." Every line was deniable. Together, they built a world. Eventually, I stopped defending myself, because I learned something ugly and useful. In a family like mine, explanations don't clear your name. They become evidence against you. If I clarified what I did, they called me defensive. If I stayed quiet, they called me vague. If I succeeded in some modest way, they reframed it until it sounded accidental. So I became quieter. Not weaker, just quieter. And when I say I was the scapegoat, I don't mean I was openly abused every hour of every day. I mean that I was assigned a role. My family needed a child whose life could be described as cautionary because Mason's brightness depended on a contrast. He was the builder. I was the warning label. He was the standard. I was the example of what happened when someone lacked discipline, polish, drive, focus, seriousness, taste, vision, stamina, or whatever word sounded best that week. If I showed up wearing something simple, I had no standards. If I wore something nicer, I was trying too hard. If I arrived late because of work, I was disorganized. If I arrived on time, my mother would say, "How nice. You're early for once." There is no winning in systems built to keep one person beneath the others. And for years I kept making the same mistake. I thought if I stayed decent long enough they might eventually feel ashamed. They didn't. Because shame requires self-awareness, and my parents didn't see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as accurate. That was the poison at the center of it. They didn't think they were failing me. They thought they were correctly assessing me. My pain wasn't unfortunate to them. It was proof that their judgment had been right all along. Mason absorbed that certainty until it hardened into identity. By his late 20s, he had developed the exact kind of confidence people mistake for competence. He talked over waiters and called it efficiency. He interrupted women and called it clarity. He made reckless financial decisions and called it vision. And because my parents had spent decades mistaking volume for leadership, they kept feeding him more room to fail upward. They bought into the version of him that sounded impressive. I noticed things before they did. That was another role I played in my family. I was the one who noticed the seams. The service staff changing too often. The landscaping being scaled back, and then suddenly restored. Expensive art disappearing from walls, and then later reappearing as if nothing had changed. Repairs delayed for months. My mother using the phrase "we're rotating pieces" in a tone that felt too casual. Bills on the sideboard from companies I didn't recognize. Quiet tension after phone calls, Mason said, were just short-term restructuring. I never asked questions out loud. Not because I didn't have them, because I already knew what would happen if I asked. My father would tell me not to concern myself with matters beyond my understanding. My mother would say it was vulgar to talk about money. Mason would grin and ask if I thought reading one article online made me qualified to evaluate complex assets. So I filed things away. The biggest mistake people made about me was assuming silence meant emptiness. It didn't. It meant storage. By the time I was 26, I had stopped attending some family dinners unless absence would create more drama than presence. My mother called that selfish. Mason called it flaky. My father called it childish. But none of them really missed me when I wasn't there. That hurt in its own clean way. I wasn't central enough to be wanted. I was only useful enough to be referenced. That was when something inside me began to cool. Not die. Cool. And cooling can be a gift if you let it become clarity instead of bitterness. I stopped asking what would make them love me. I started asking a different question. What would my life look like if I never got that love at all? That question saved me. It didn't save me in one pretty moment. There was no triumphant montage. No perfect night where I finally saw my worth in the mirror and walked into a better life. It was uglier and more adult than that. I saved myself in spreadsheets, in invoices, in contracts, in humiliatingly long work weeks, in cheap meals, in turning down the need to look impressive so I could become difficult to destabilize. I built my life the only way I trusted life to be built. Quietly. But before I got there, my family gave me one last lesson in exactly what I was to them. The meeting in the library was bad from the beginning. It started with Mason calling it a housekeeping issue, which told me almost everything I needed to know. In his mind, deciding what happened to me was not emotionally complicated. It was a matter of tidying the family structure so it reflected reality. His reality anyway. The library smelled like polished wood and old paper. The curtains were half open. There was a legal pad in front of Henderson, the family attorney, and a thick stack of documents clipped into neat sections. My mother wore soft cream cashmere, and the expression she reserved for situations where she wanted to look wounded by someone else's inconvenience. My father had that tight, flattened mouth he used when he wanted to signal authority without raising his voice. Mason looked almost cheerful. He had come straight from somewhere that required a collared shirt but not a jacket. His watch caught the light every time he moved his hand. He mentioned within the first 5 minutes that he needed this wrapped quickly because he had a tea time later. That was Mason in a sentence, rearranging a family's future between lunch and golf. Henderson began by saying, "We were there to review the trust structure and make final decisions about distribution language contingencies and asset schedules." He was calm in the way good attorneys are calm, not warm, not cold, just exact. His job was not to soothe anyone. His job was to document reality. Mason took that as permission to begin performing. "I think we all know the practical answer here," he said. "If the goal is preserving the family's legacy, then the trust should reflect who's actually been carrying that responsibility." He didn't look at me when he said it. That was deliberate. Mason liked insults to land in front of other people first. It made them harder to challenge. My mother gave a small nod, the kind that pretends to be modest but is really approval. My father folded his hands and said nothing. Mason continued. "I'm not saying Chloe gets nothing. I'm not trying to be cruel. But let's be serious. She's not equipped to manage any of this. She's still drifting from project to project. She drives a 15-year-old Honda. She shops like a college student. Half the time nobody even knows what she does." Then he finally looked at me. "I think she'd be happier with something simple. Personal items, maybe a modest cash provision. Enough to help, not enough to create dependency." That line hit the room and stayed there. Create dependency. As if I were the one who'd been feeding off the family. My mother leaned forward and placed 2 fingers on the table like she was delivering bad news to a child. "Henderson, I do think it would be wise to protect Chloe from responsibility she's not ready for. She has always struggled with follow-through. Mason, for all his faults, is at least built for pressure. For all his faults." Even her attempt at fairness was flattering to him. My father finally spoke. "The estate should go where it can be stewarded properly." He said it like a man discussing weather patterns. No emotion, no apology, no curiosity about how it might feel to hear your father explain in front of a lawyer that you were unfit to inherit your own family's confidence. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap and felt something terrible and familiar move through me. Not shock. The opposite. Recognition. That moment when reality becomes so clear it almost calms you. They were not improvising. None of this was spontaneous. They had discussed it. Agreed on language. Come prepared to describe my life as a cautionary expense. Mason wasn't done. In fact, he said, flipping one page toward Henderson, I think we should include language preventing future disputes. I've seen these situations go bad. Someone feels entitled suddenly. There are emotional claims, legal headaches, people trying to claw back what they never earned. Better to make it clean now. He smiled a little at the word earned. Then he added, no offense, Chloe. That was the lowest point. Not because I believed them, because I realized they didn't need me to. They were perfectly happy creating a permanent version of me on paper. One where I was unstable, dependent, unserious, and lucky to receive anything at all. One where Mason wasn't simply preferred. He was justified. The last childish part of me that had been hiding somewhere deep down, waiting for my parents to choose me once in my life, died right there at that table. And if you've ever been the one your family used as contrast, the one they made smaller so the favorite could look brighter, then you know this kind of pain has its own smell. It's not loud, it's sterile, it sounds like people speaking reasonably while they erase you. If you know that feeling, put toxic in the comments. I want to know who else learned that blood can be the first place contempt learns your name. Henderson had been quiet through all of it. He took notes once or twice. Adjusted a page. Asked my father one question about timing. But as Mason kept talking, I noticed something strange. Henderson still hadn't made the mark I expected him to make. He hadn't begun finalizing the distribution schedule. He hadn't acknowledged Mason's assumptions as usable. Instead, he set one page aside and drew another stack closer. His tone stayed neutral, but the rhythm of the meeting shifted in a way only people paying attention would catch. He asked, before we finalize beneficiary allocations, I need to confirm the current title and ownership structure of the listed assets. Mason made a face like someone had interrupted him to explain a stapler. With respect, Henderson, those are family assets. That's the whole point. Henderson didn't look at him. He looked at my father. I need clarification from the record. My father's jaw moved once. The house, the vehicles, the investment accounts, those are the core assets. Henderson nodded, but not the way people nod when they've gotten what they need, more like a man checking how committed someone is to the wrong answer. Then he asked, very carefully, are you representing those as personally held by you and Mrs. Whitmore, or through entities under your direct control? Mason laughed. Is there a difference that matters here? There was a pause. Not a long one, just long enough for every nerve in my body to turn toward it. My father didn't answer right away. My mother said, Richard, honestly, surely that's all already in the file. It was such a small line, but it told me she didn't know. Or didn't know enough. Mason rolled his pen between his fingers with the lazy impatience of someone who thinks administrative details are for lesser people. Henderson removed his glasses, wiped one lens, and put them back on. That's when I knew the room had split. Not visibly. Not yet. But the meeting had stopped being about what my family wanted, and become about what they could prove. For years, I had watched little signs that the family's wealth wasn't as solid as they pretended. A property tax issue that got brushed off. A refinancing conversation I overheard halfway through. A weekend when my mother fired the florist she'd used for 12 years because she was simplifying. Mason calling something a temporary liquidity issue with the kind of forced confidence men use when they're trying to outrun numbers. At the time, I didn't press. I had already learned that being the family scapegoat means your observations never count as intelligence. They count as bitterness. So I stopped offering them. But I remembered. And sitting there in that library watching Henderson ask questions Mason could not answer cleanly, I felt something I hadn't felt in that house in a long time. Not vindication. Not yet. Just the first thin line of possibility. Henderson turned another page. Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to ask once more for the record. Is the property presently held in your name jointly with Mrs. Whitmore, or by a trust or limited liability entity under your control. Mason let out a breath through his nose. This is getting ridiculous. My father still didn't look at me. He said I assume under the family structure. Assume. That word changed the temperature in the room. My mother sat up straighter. What does that mean, assume? Henderson folded his hands. It means I cannot proceed on assumptions. Mason's voice sharpened. Then don't proceed on assumptions. Proceed on common sense. That almost made me smile, because common sense had been the religion in my family for years. Common sense said Mason was successful because he looked successful. Common sense said I was failing because I looked modest. Common sense said people with real money didn't drive old Hondas or wear the same coat for 4 winters or buy their coffee without caring which cafe made the best impression. Common sense said appearances were evidence, and common sense in that room was about to die. It's a strange thing to sit inside the moment your whole family is about to discover they've been worshipping the wrong god. They still looked the same. Same clothes, same posture, same voices. But the hierarchy I had lived under my whole life had started to loosen before they knew it. The questions Henderson was asking were small enough to sound procedural. But underneath them was a blade. Who owns this? Who controls that? What do the records show? People like Mason think power belongs to the loudest person in the room, until they meet paperwork. And then they learn silence has structure. 5 years earlier, after one more dinner where Mason had explained success to me as if he'd invented effort, I drove home in my old Honda and cried so hard I had to pull over before getting on the highway. Not because of anything especially new. That was what made it worse. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one had screamed. My mother had simply asked Mason about an upcoming deal. My father had said he was proud of the way Mason carried the family name. Then, after an hour of listening to them talk to him like he was the future, my mother turned to me and asked if I was still doing the little contract work. The little contract work. I smiled. I said yes. She nodded with that polished, pitying expression and asked if I had thought about something more stable. I drove away and cried because I finally understood I could spend the rest of my life being good and it would never become visible to them in a form they respected. That night changed me. Not in a cinematic way, in the adult way. The real way. I stopped spending energy trying to make my life legible to people committed to misunderstanding it. The truth was, my work had already begun changing. The freelance jobs my family mocked had led me into a business most people would call boring. I built software tools for regional logistics companies first, then for larger operations with ugly, unglamorous supply chain problems no one wanted to think about until they lost money. Vendor risk, compliance failures, contract timing, fragile links in systems that looked stable from the outside. I was good at that work because I understood something most people ignored. The collapse usually starts before the room notices. That skill made me valuable. Then it made me successful. Then slowly it made me wealthy. Not overnight. Not by magic. Not by one lucky investor, or one viral moment, or one sudden acquisition that turned me into a different woman. I built safety the least glamorous way possible. I worked obscene hours. I learned where to cut cost, and where not to. I kept ownership longer than people expected. I didn't spend money to prove I had it. I didn't upgrade my life every time my revenue did. I lived the way people live when they've been made scared of instability early. The first time I crossed into real money, no one in my family knew. The second time they still didn't know. By the third I understood something almost funny. If I never changed the exterior, they would never ask the right questions. I could stand in front of them as the same old Chloe in the same practical coat with the same old car, and they would fill in the rest out of habit. So I let them. At first I kept the Honda because it ran, then I kept it because it told me things. It told me which people only respected visible wealth. It told me who thought simplicity was failure. It told me who performed kindness downward because they thought I needed it. A surprising number of people reveal themselves when they think you can't do anything for them. My family revealed themselves constantly. As my business grew, I moved more and more through structures my parents didn't understand and Mason would have dismissed as dull. Holding companies, private placements, acquisition vehicles, Quiet investments in the kinds of assets attention seekers overlook because they can't brag about them at dinner. Safety, I learned, is often boring on purpose. Then one year, through an investment channel connected to one of my entities, I saw a distressed note package that made me pause. The holding information looked familiar. The property history looked familiar. The layering of refinances looked familiar. And when I dug one level deeper, I found Mason's fingerprints all over it. Not literally, of course. Men like Mason rarely sign the page that finally ruins them. They build the conditions for it. They overestimate, overleverage, sell confidence instead of discipline, convince everyone around them that risk is temporary and recovery is inevitable. What I found was a chain of decisions that had hollowed out my family's supposed stability years earlier. A bad investment cycle, guarantees that should never have been made, property exposure hidden under optimistic language, enough damage that the life my parents were still performing as old money was no longer actually theirs in the simple way they imagined it to be. When the note became actionable, I had a choice: ignore it and let the market eat them. Step in publicly and become the daughter who rescued the family. Or step in quietly and become something else entirely. I chose quiet. I acquired the note through one of my entities, then moved in the cleanest legal direction available. The property was folded under an LLC. Carrying costs were stabilized. Exposure was contained. The family kept living in the mansion. The bills kept getting paid. The appearances stayed intact. From the outside, nothing changed. Underneath, everything had. People always imagine revenge as heat. Mine was never hot. It was cold enough to think. I didn't do it because I wanted my parents to owe me gratitude. I had already learned gratitude in that family only flowed upward toward the child they admired. I didn't do it because I wanted Mason to collapse dramatically. Public implosions satisfy the audience, but they rarely answer the private question underneath the hurt. My question was simpler and sadder. If they thought I was ordinary, disappointing, and beneath them, how would they treat me when my name carried no visible power at all? I wanted to know whether there was anything in them that could still see me without status. So I let them keep seeing what they were used to seeing. I kept my clothes simple. I kept my life private. I let them think the old Honda meant the old story. I let them assume my modest apartment was the measure of my reach. I showed up to holidays with pie or wine or flowers like any other daughter and watched them read me through the cheapest possible lens. They failed the test every time. That was the real rebuilding. Not the money. The detachment. The day I stopped measuring my worth against people who only respected surfaces, I began building a life no one in that house had the tools to evaluate. And that came with a price. Success bought in silence is still lonely. There were nights I worked until sunrise, and then sat in a kitchen lit only by the stove clock, too wired to sleep, staring at numbers I'd once prayed for, and feeling absolutely nothing. There were times I wanted to call my mother, and tell her I had done it, really done it, built something solid, something smart, something so carefully mine, that no one could take it from me, but I never called, because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. The first question wouldn't be, "Are you happy?" It would be, "How big then? Who knows then? What does this mean for the family?" That was when I understood the cleanest boundary I had ever drawn. I did not owe them access to the version of me they would have respected only once it became useful. By the time Henderson learned who sat behind the LLC, the structure was already settled. He had known my family for years, so there was a complicated kind of dignity in the way he handled it. He never treated me like a child carrying out a private grudge. He treated me like what I was. The beneficial owner, the person with legal standing, the one paying the bills. I remember the first private call we had after he understood the full picture. He said, "You are aware they do not know." I said, "I'm aware." He asked, "And you want to keep it that way for now?" I did not answer immediately. Then I said, "Yes." He paused and said, "May I ask why?" And for some reason that question almost broke me. Not because it was hard to answer. Because it was the first time anyone connected to my family had asked me why without already assuming the answer. I told him the truth. "I want to know if they would still treat me like this, if they thought I had nothing they wanted." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I suspect you already know." I did. But knowing privately and hearing it proven publicly are not the same thing. So I waited. I let time do what time does. I let Mason keep performing. I let my parents keep confusing poise with character. I let the house continue standing around them, while they mistook continued occupancy for ownership. And somewhere in the back of my mind I knew there might come a day when Mason got arrogant enough to drag inheritance into the light. He always did love declaring himself the future before checking the books. That day arrived in the library. And before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you've ever watched a family use one child as the floor another child gets to stand on, put scapegoat in the comments. Because people who haven't lived it think the pain is jealousy. It isn't. It's being treated like you were built to carry someone else's ego. When Henderson finally spoke, the room had the kind of silence that only comes when people still think they're in control. He straightened one stack of papers, glanced once at my father, and said, "Before we address distribution language, I need to clarify a material issue affecting the trust." Mason let out a breath like a man indulging bureaucracy. "Can we please not make this more complicated than it is?" Henderson did not raise his voice. "It is already more complicated than represented." That line hit Mason wrong. I could see it. His posture shifted just enough for the confidence to look forced instead of natural. My mother tried to smooth the room. "Then perhaps you can explain the complication briefly." Henderson nodded. "I can." He opened the file in front of him and placed one document on top of the others. As of 5 years ago, the Whitmore family position experienced a series of financial events tied to leverage decisions and guaranteed exposures associated with Mr. Mason Whitmore's investment activity. Mason frowned. "What does that have to do with today?" Henderson looked at him for the first time in several minutes. "Everything." Then he kept going. "The resulting defaults altered control over several assets assumed here to be part of the personal estate." My father leaned forward. "Altered control?" How Henderson answered in the same tone someone might use to confirm a mailing address. "The primary residence-related carrying costs and certain lifestyle maintenance obligations have not been under your direct ownership or control for several years." My mother blinked. "I'm sorry." What Mason's laugh came out too fast. "That's absurd." Henderson didn't react. "The residence is presently held through a limited liability company." Mason spread one hand at the room. "Fine. Through a company. Plenty of properties are held through companies. That doesn't change anything." Henderson turned the final page over. "It changes everything when the company is not yours." No one moved. I have replayed that second in my head more times than I can count. Not because anyone said anything extraordinary. Because nothing happened for just long enough that the truth had time to become physical. My mother's face lost color first. My father's hand stayed on the table but stopped looking attached to him. Mason stared at Henderson with the kind of offense men wear when reality has violated their self-image. Then finally he said, "Whose company?" Henderson placed the document flat between us. "The beneficial owner of the LLC holding the property is Chloe." It did not feel like winning. It felt like gravity. Mason looked at me so hard it almost would have been funny in another life. "That's impossible." My mother turned toward me, then away from me, then back again, like her eyes couldn't finish the journey. "My father said my name once. Just once. Chloe." That was the first time anyone in that room had said my name all afternoon without using it as an explanation for weakness. Mason leaned forward, both hands on the table now. "No. No, that's wrong. She can't own this house." Henderson said she does. Mason looked at me again, this time with open disbelief. "You have nothing." And there it was. The whole religion of my family in 4 words: you have nothing. Not because he had audited my life. Not because he knew my books. Not because he understood my work, my holdings, my decisions, or the structures under them. Because I looked wrong to him. Because I had never translated my value into the kind of costume he respected. Because he had been trained since childhood to believe visible ease belonged to him, and visible restraint meant failure in me. I finally looked back at him. "That's the problem," I said. "You only know how to count what's loud." No one spoke. My mother's mouth opened slightly. My father's eyes moved to Henderson, and back to me. Mason sat down slowly, then stood back up, as if anger might restore the room if he could get enough of it into his body. "This is some kind of game." "No," I said. "This is paperwork." He actually laughed once, sharp and stunned. You expect me to believe that you've just been quietly sitting on enough money to buy the house while driving that car and showing up in those clothes. I could have answered 100 different ways. I could have listed numbers. I could have named the deals. I could have humiliated him with specifics. Instead, I said the simplest true thing. People with something real don't always need an audience. That landed harder than shouting would have. My mother found her voice next. Chloe, why would you do this? Why would you keep something like this from your family? Family. The word suddenly sounded expensive coming from her. I almost asked which family she meant. The one that discussed me like a liability. The one that had just tried to write me out of my own history. The one that had watched Mason call me dependent, and nodded along. Instead, I kept my tone flat. You didn't ask. That hurt her more than anger would have. Because it was true. They had never asked what I was building. They had only asked why it didn't look more like Mason. Mason slapped one palm against the table. This is unbelievable. There has to be fraud here. Dad, say something. My father looked older than he had 10 minutes earlier. What exactly, he asked Henderson, are you saying? Henderson shifted the papers and answered with surgical precision. I am saying, the property and associated obligations have been controlled through an entity whose beneficial owner is Chloe. I am saying the trust cannot distribute what is not currently part of your personal estate in the form represented. I am also saying the financial assumptions underlying this meeting were materially inaccurate. My mother whispered. No. Mason snapped. How long? He asked it like an accusation. I answered anyway. 5 years. His head turned so fast I thought for a second he might actually lose balance. 5 years, yes. For 5 years you let us, I cut in. Live here, yes. He stared at me. My father said very quietly, you knew. I met his eyes. Yes. That was the first honest exchange my father and I had maybe ever had. No performance. No euphemism. Just recognition. Mason started pacing. That doesn't make sense. If you had that kind of money, why live like that? Why pretend? I felt something cold and exact settle in me. I didn't pretend to be modest. I was modest. You're the one who decided modest meant worthless. He stopped pacing. My mother looked at me as if searching for the daughter she believed she had catalogued years ago. You mean to say, she said slowly, all this time I said you were measuring me with the wrong instrument. And then I gave them the line I had not known I would say until the second it arrived. Before you decided what I deserved from this house, you should have checked who owned it. That was the moment Mason broke. Not outwardly, not yet, but something in his face fell away. He could no longer speak from elevation. Every word now had to fight through panic. The room knew it before he did. He looked to my parents for reinforcement, and found none. My mother was too shocked. My father was doing the math. Henderson was turning to the next section of documents. And I sat there still in the same coat, still with the same hands folded in my lap, watching a lifetime of assumptions collapse under the weight of one fact they could not style their way out of. If you were sitting where I was in that exact silence with the people who had diminished you, suddenly unable to explain the ground under their own feet, would you walk or stay in the comments? Because that silence felt powerful. But what came after it was cleaner. I stayed. Mason tried first. That didn't surprise me. Men like him always think outrage can buy them time. This is insane, he said. There were market issues. Everyone took hits. You can't just twist normal restructuring into some story where I ruined the family. Henderson didn't lift his eyes. I'm not twisting anything, Mr. Whitmore. I'm reading from documented filings, guarantees, notices, and transfer records. My father's voice came out rougher than I had ever heard it. Mason. What did you sign? Mason turned too quickly. Nothing you didn't know about. That was the closest thing to a confession I needed. My mother looked between them. Richard. My father didn't answer her. He kept staring at Mason. What did you sign? Mason ran both hands over his face. It was supposed to be temporary. We were bridging exposure. I had investors lined up. There it was. Not remorse. Rationale. That was Mason all the way down. Even at the edge of collapse, he wasn't sorry for the risk. He was angry the timing had failed him. Henderson slid one page across the table. Guarantees were extended beyond reasonable recovery assumptions. Default notices followed. Subsequent property control shifted, according to the terms in place. My mother's eyes moved helplessly over the paper without absorbing it. This can't be happening. It already happened, I said. She turned toward me like I had struck her. That was the thing about my family. Reality felt cruel to them whenever it stopped flattering them. Henderson continued. The residents carrying costs, tax obligations, insurance, maintenance, and related support expenses were stabilized through the holding entity. My father looked at him, then at me. You've been paying for this house, yes. My mother's hand went to her chest. For how long? For years. Why wouldn't you tell us? I could have answered with bitterness. Instead, I chose precision. Because if I had told you sooner, you would have treated the money well before you treated me well. No one in the room could argue with that. That was maybe the most satisfying part of the entire afternoon. Not that they were shocked. Not that Mason looked sick. Not even that my mother had lost the elegance of her own face. It was that the truth I had lived with for years was finally sitting in the room where denial could no longer protect them. Henderson, who had witnessed enough families fracture to know, when emotion was about to corrupt clarity, stepped in at exactly the right moment. For the sake of the record, he said, I would advise focusing now on what is documentable. Intent can be debated. Ownership cannot. Bless him for that. Because ownership was the point. My family had always behaved as if narrative outranked fact. If they said Mason was responsible, then he was responsible. If they said I was unstable, then I was unstable. If they said the house was theirs, then it was theirs. They thought repetition could create reality. But paper is indifferent to family myth. Henderson laid out the sequence cleanly. Dates, filings, transfers, obligations, the points at which things changed hands. The points at which my family stopped living on inherited security and started living inside a structure they did not control. The points at which Mason's choices stopped being aggressive and became expensive enough to move property. Mason kept trying to interrupt. Every time he did, Henderson answered with another date, another document, another page. It was almost beautiful. Not because it was cruel, because it was exact. At one point Mason said, "You're making me sound reckless." Henderson replied, "I'm making you sound documented." That was the second best line of the day. The first was still mine. My father went quiet in a way I had never seen before. He was a man who had spent his entire life trusting tone, class, and control as substitutes for humility. Now he was watching his preferred child, the son he believed had protected the family's future, revealed through the least glamorous language possible. Obligation, exposure, default, transfer. My mother wasn't built for language like that. She liked words that implied beauty and taste and standards. Henderson's vocabulary had none of those things. It had the brutal utility of consequences. She kept trying to reach for softer ground. There must have been a misunderstanding. No. We were told things would recover. Not the point. We didn't know Chloe was involved. Exactly. That last one mattered most. Because whether they knew I was involved didn't change whether I had been carrying them. And when that truth fully landed, so did the real reversal. All my life they had said I leaned on the family, that I drifted, that I needed structure. That Mason built and I consumed. Now in one afternoon the opposite became undeniable. I had not been the daughter clinging to family stability. They had been living inside mine without even recognizing it. I looked at my father and asked the question I had earned. When you said I wasn't equipped to steward anything, what exactly did you think had been keeping all this standing? He opened his mouth, closed it. That silence healed something in me. Not because it erased the past. Nothing does that. Because it put the past in its correct shape. They had not overlooked my value accidentally. They had been blind by choice. Mason tried one last angle. He looked at me with a strained kind of disbelief and said, "So this was what? A test? You sat there for years pretending to be beneath us just to catch us out." I held his gaze. "I never pretended to be beneath you. You needed me there." "That's different." He shook his head. "No normal person does this." I almost laughed. No normal person spends years humiliating his sister in rooms full of people because her restraint makes him feel superior either. But men like Mason always think their own behavior is baseline, and everyone else's response is the aberration. So I told him the truth he could understand. I wanted one honest answer. To what? To whether any of you could love me without being impressed first. That ended him more cleanly than any insult. My mother's face crumpled around the eyes. Not enough to make me trust it. Just enough to show impact. My father looked away. Mason stared at the floor, then back at me, then at Henderson like he was trying to locate the version of reality where he still outranked me. He couldn't. Because the documents had done what family systems never do voluntarily. They had reassigned position. And here is the ugliest, cleanest truth in all of it. The money mattered less to me than the reversal of the sentence they had always spoken over my life. I was not the cautionary tale. I was not the one who had failed to carry weight. I was not the sibling orbiting competence. I was the one who had built something durable enough to hold an entire family above water while they mocked the shape of the boat. So I said the line that had been waiting years to be spoken. You didn't carry me. You just never realized whose money was carrying you. No one in that room recovered from that. Not fully. Not even me. Because once the sentence was out, everything after it was aftermath. If someone betrayed you for years, and only found respect the second they learned your silence had been strength all along, would you forgive them, or would you close the door, and never explain yourself again? Put forgive or close the door in the comments. I knew my answer before I stood up, but hearing yours matters, because people love preaching grace when they've never had to build it on top of contempt. The first one to pivot was my mother. That also didn't surprise me. Cruel people are often quicker than ashamed people when they sense power moving. Chloe, she said, and suddenly my name sounded soft in her mouth. Tender almost. Sweetheart, if there were misunderstandings, we can work through them. No one here wanted to hurt you. I looked at her for a long moment. That was the closest she had come to asking for mercy all day, and still she couldn't say the words actually required. We were wrong, we hurt you. We chose him. We used you. She wanted absolution at the price of vagueness. I didn't give it to her. You did want to hurt me, I said. Maybe not in a way that felt dramatic to you. But yes. You wanted me smaller. You wanted me less credible. You wanted him above me so badly that you were willing to call it fairness while you did it. Tears gathered in her eyes, and a much younger version of me would have panicked at that sight. My mother's pain used to work on me even when I knew it was selective. I used to feel responsible for soothing emotions she had no trouble causing in others. Not anymore. My father finally spoke again. Chloe, whatever has happened here, we are still your family. That line might have moved me once. It didn't now. Because the saddest part of toxic families is that family only becomes sacred when accountability gets close enough to touch them. I said you were willing to erase me as family 30 minutes ago. He flinched. Good. Mason, still pale, tried a different tactic. You made your point. That one almost made me smile. My point. As if this were theater. As if the entire issue were that I had embarrassed him instead of the fact that he had spent years moving through a life supported by structures he did not understand while treating me like a burden. No, I said. The documents made the point. He stood up too fast. So what now? You throw us out. You destroy everything because you're angry. There it was again. The belief that enforcing reality is cruelty when it stops benefiting the entitled. I stayed seated. Everything that's happening now is happening because you confused access with ownership. My mother's voice shook. We can fix this. I looked at her. No. We can clarify it. Then I turned to Henderson. I want all future communication regarding the property occupancy and related financial matters handled through you. My mother stared at me. Chloe. I kept going. I want formal notice prepared. I want current occupancy rights reviewed under the existing agreements. I want Mason removed from any assumption of control representation, or access connected to the residence, or any associated accounts. Mason barked out a laugh. You can't be serious. I met his eyes. I'm the only person in this room who has been serious the whole time. That was the final mic drop. Not loud, not flashy, but true enough to end discussion. My father rubbed one hand over his face. Is this really necessary? That question told me everything. Necessary. As if necessity begins the moment the person with power feels uncomfortable. as if the years before this had not required anything from them. As if I had not already done the stretching, absorbing, rationalizing, minimizing, forgiving, and understanding for an entire family who never once asked what it cost me. Yes, I said. It is. My mother cried then. Quietly, again not enough to reach me. Not because I'm heartless. Because I know the difference between grief and panic. She was not mourning the daughter she had failed. She was mourning the collapse of a world in which she could keep misjudging me without consequence. Mason moved closer to the table and lowered his voice, which was somehow uglier than shouting. After everything you do this to your own brother, I looked at him and felt almost nothing. No, I said. After everything, I'm finally refusing to let my brother do things to me. That was the line I wish I could hand to every person who has ever been told boundaries are cruelty. They aren't. They just feel cruel to people who depended on your lack of them. Henderson began gathering the relevant sections with the calm efficiency of a man who had long ago stopped expecting family money to produce family decency. He asked me 2 practical questions. I answered both. He confirmed next steps in concise language. Review, notice, control, transfer, communication channel. No drama, just process. My father sat there as if process itself were insulting. My mother whispered, "Please don't do this like strangers." I stood for the first time since the meeting began. It felt strange how simple it was. All afternoon the room had been built around judgment, around history, around role, around the version of me they had rehearsed for years. But once I stood up, I understood something almost startling. I was no longer pinned to their interpretation of me. Not emotionally, not financially, not structurally. I was just a woman standing in a room she had paid to preserve, looking at the people who had mistaken her restraint for lack, deciding what distance would finally make peace possible, so I gave them the most honest thing I had. The saddest part isn't that you loved money more than me, I said. It's that even when it was mine, you still didn't know who I was. No one answered. What could they say? That they would have behaved differently if I'd arrived in a better car. That they would have respected me if I'd made my success more visible, more masculine, more branded, more digestible to people who need wealth to perform itself. That they would have loved me if I had accessorized my competence properly. Those aren't answers. They're indictments. I picked up my bag from the chair beside me. My mother said my name one last time. There was pleading in it now. Real pleading. The kind that arrives too late and expects history to be discounted because fear has finally made someone sincere. I did not turn that into cruelty. I did not humiliate her. I did not list every year, every dinner, every joke, every side glance, every small elegant cut she had made, and expected me to live inside. I just said I'm done being the place this family stores what it doesn't want to admit about itself. Then I walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Mason start talking again too fast, words colliding with anger and disbelief. I heard my father tell him to stop. I heard my mother cry in a thin, careful way, like even heartbreak in that house had once needed to remain tasteful. Henderson opened the door for me. That detail stays with me. Not because it was grand, because it was the first gentle thing that had happened to me in that room all day. I stepped into the hallway, then out through the front of the house, and when the door closed behind me, the quiet that met me outside felt different from every other kind of quiet I had known. It was late afternoon, Connecticut light, cold air. The kind that wakes your skin up instead of punishing it. For years, silence had meant exclusion to me. It meant I wasn't chosen, wasn't defended, wasn't invited deeply enough into the circle to matter. But standing there on the stone path with my keys in my hand, and my old Honda parked where it had always been parked, silence felt like ownership, not of the house, of myself. People talk about freedom like it's some bright cinematic thing, like it arrives with music, and sudden joy, and a perfect sentence that explains everything. Mine didn't. Mine arrived as the absence of one need. I no longer needed my family to see me correctly in order for me to remain intact. That was freedom. Not the money, not the LLC, not the legal standing. Those mattered. They protected me. They gave me leverage. They created the outcome. But freedom was simpler. Freedom was realizing that the people who had measured me wrong all my life no longer had access to the scale. I stood there for a moment and let that settle. Then I got into the car Mason loved, mocking, closed the door, and sat with my hands on the wheel. I thought about the girl I used to be. The one who still dressed for family dinners with some stupid hidden hope that tonight might be different. The one who kept trying to say the right thing in the right tone, thinking precision might finally earn tenderness. The one who carried the family's contempt like maybe it was data. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her this. You were never what they said. You were just the easiest person to misname, because you kept your worth where shallow people couldn't see it. Then I started the engine. And before I leave you here, I want 3 honest answers. First, did my family deserve to lose everything they thought they controlled after treating me the way they did? Second, have you ever been the scapegoat in your own family, the one who got blamed, minimized, or used to make someone else look better? And third, after a betrayal like this, would you forgive? Or would you close the door for good? Tell me in the comments. And if this story hit something real and you like it, share it with someone who needs the reminder and subscribe. Because sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stop asking to be loved correctly by people who only know how to value what shines the loudest.